Hello everyone. In this AP exam review video, we're going to focus on the most important need-to-know Supreme Court cases. Our first stop is the era of the Marshall Court, which lasts most of Period 4. Chief Justice John Marshall was appointed by John Adams, who was a Federalist. The Supreme Court under Marshall would hold true to Federalist aims, as through its rulings it would increase the powers of the national government and diminish the powers of state governments. So even though the Federalist Party itself would fade away in the early 1800s, the Supreme Court will keep its philosophy on the government and the Constitution alive for a few decades. Now let's take a look at three of the most important decisions under the Marshall Court. The first one, and the one that is fundamentally important to the Supreme Court's power, is its decision in Marbury v. Madison. The Supreme Court gave itself the power of judicial review, which meant it can decide if laws and executive actions are constitutional, and it can clarify laws. This is the main power of the Supreme Court. Two of the decisions that helped to strengthen the national government are McCulloch v. Maryland in 1819, which upheld the right of Congress to charter a national bank and be free from taxation by a state, thus putting into national law the doctrine of implied powers, and Gibbons v. Ogden in 1824, which gave the national government undisputed control over interstate commerce by ruling invalid a steamboat monopoly chartered by New York State. This freed internal transportation from state restraint. So interstate transportation and commerce were under the jurisdiction of the national government, not states. The last famous case of the Marshall Court we're going to look at is Worcester v. Georgia. The state of Georgia was attempting to regulate Cherokee land, which was negotiated as a treaty with the federal government. Georgia would lose the case as the court ruled that states do not have the right to regulate Native American territory and people. That falls under the jurisdiction of U.S. treaties and laws, which is the federal government. The case itself is important for establishing tribal sovereignty. However, it would not prevent the removal of the Cherokee by the federal government. Moving past the Marshall Court now and into the turbulent 1850s with a divisive slavery question. Dred Scott, who was enslaved but had resided a significant amount of his life in the free territory of Illinois, filed a lawsuit for his freedom, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, headed by pro-slavery Chief Justice Roger Taney. Taney asked the question, can a black man imported into this country become entitled to all rights of citizens? And Taney's answer that he wrote in the court's majority opinion was no, including all black people, slave or free. The decision said that the court had no jurisdiction over Dred Scott because he is not a citizen, so he has no right to sue. Taney also went a step further in his decision, which struck down the Missouri Compromise, and depending on how one read the decision, seemed to permit slavery in all of the territories, and possibly northern free states as well. The South cheered the decision, and abolitionists were horrified by it. Our next stop is the post-Civil War era. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, also known as the Reconstruction Amendments, were hallmarks of the radical Republicans' attempts at bringing about full citizenship to former enslaved African Americans. However, the amendments would be weakened in two key rulings. The first is known as the Slaughterhouse Cases, which is a series of cases rolled into one decision. The details about a business monopoly are not terribly important. What you need to know is that the court ruled that the 14th Amendment only banned the states from depriving blacks of equal rights. It did not guarantee that all citizens, regardless of race, should receive equal economic privileges by the state. So the ruling allows for economic discrimination and overall reduces the 14th Amendment protections. Then there is the infamous Plessy v. Ferguson case. In it, the court rejected the idea that the 14th Amendment applied to social situations, so states could have laws that required social segregation. The ruling was the basis of the Jim Crow segregation era, as it upheld the constitutionality of segregated facilities as long as the facilities were equal in quality, which we know that was never the case. It would take several decades for that terrible Plessy decision to be overturned, but landmark ruling Brown v. Board of Education would also invigorate the civil rights movement. In the ruling, the Supreme Court held that separate but equal facilities were inherently unequal and violate the protections of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Important note that this did not instantly get rid of segregation. That would still be a long struggle, but Brown v. Board was the first important step. The Scopes Monkey trial is our only case that is not a Supreme Court case. However, it is a very important trial, and I wanted to fit it in. The decade of the 1920s is known for a lot of trends and forces, like the booming economy and prohibition. However, another very important aspect were the cultural conflicts between modernists and fundamentalists, or traditionalists. This played out in Tennessee, which passed a law that made it illegal to teach about the new science of evolution. The law was challenged by teacher John Scopes, who received a $100 fine, which he disputed in court. The case itself brought the spotlight of the national media and high-profile politicians and lawyers. The overall outcome is not really important. The big takeaway is how the case highlights the cultural debates of the 1920s. During the height of the Great Depression, President Franklin Roosevelt and his fellow Democrats took power and passed a sweeping series of progressive legislation to combat the Great Depression. The legislation also changed the role of the government in the economy, greatly advancing it into many areas the government had never before touched. The one institution FDR ran up against, though, was the Supreme Court, which had conservative justice appointees from Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover years who disagreed with the constitutionality of some of the New Deal programs. They struck down some of FDR's most important New Deal laws, including the National Recovery Act and the Agricultural Adjustment Act. FDR was very unhappy with this, and after another huge electoral victory in 1936, he sent through legislation in Congress asking for the power to pack the Supreme Court with more justices. The Supreme Court stopped striking down the New Deal programs, and FDR backed down from packing the court. Another thematic area to look at with the Supreme Court decisions are its rulings that extend government powers during wartime, which also restricted specific freedoms. The first case is Schneck v. U.S. In this case, during World War I, Charles Schneck delivered leaflets that were against the draft. He was arrested for violating the 1917 Espionage Act. Schneck appealed that the Espionage Act violated freedom of speech. However, the Supreme Court ruled against Schneck and in favor of government wartime powers. The court said that speech that constitutes a clear and present danger can be restricted. Next, we jump to World War II and Executive Order 9066, which ordered the internment of Japanese living on the West Coast, some of whom were citizens. Everything was taken from these Japanese Americans as they were forced to live in internment camps. Fred Korematsu sued the government, saying it was violating their basic rights. However, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the government, citing the strategic imperative of the order during wartime. Okay, next up are reproductive rights cases, both of which are examples of cultural conflicts in periods 8 and 9. The first is on the question of contraception for women, also known as birth control. The court ruled in Griswold v. Connecticut that a late 1800s restriction on the use of contraception was unconstitutional based on the right of marital privacy. So it was then legal for married couples to have access to contraceptives. Next is the one Supreme Court ruling still discussed and debated in the news and other media today in 2021, Roe v. Wade, in which the Supreme Court ruled a woman's right to choose whether or not to terminate a pregnancy falls within the right to privacy. State law cannot completely prohibit abortions. However, it can impose regulations after the first trimester. Okay, our last case is Regents v. Bake, or is it Bach? I'm not sure how to say that. But anyways, this dealt with the controversial affirmative action legislation, which says that employers and universities should take into consideration historical discrimination and prejudice against groups of people when admitting or hiring. Some universities instituted minimum quotas of acceptance of minority students. This was challenged when a white applicant was denied admission into a California medical school, which had set aside 16 out of its 100 spots for minority students. The Supreme Court ruled affirmative action can be considered when making admission decisions. However, specific racial quotas were impermissible. Okay, that does it for our Supreme Court cases review. I hope this video will help you on your exam day. Good luck!